Back. Season 15, episode 1, the first episode for a year and a day. Yesterday, we kind of accidentally went live with just a little test run that we were doing, but we were just testing equipment and everything, and suddenly we were live, and we just kind of kept it going for about 35 minutes, I guess, Steve.
Something like that.
Yep. But you've got
500 viewers.
Yeah, we had 500 viewers yesterday, so that's not too bad. And I'm trying to stream on Rumble for the first time. I don't know if it's working. It's supposed to be, but I don't know if it is or not, actually. I don't see it clicking in if it is going on Rumble, but trying to broadcast for the first time on Rumble today. Looks like it put the video up and then is not streaming there. I don't know. So anyway, first time back in a year and a day. And so thanks everybody for joining us today. And there's already a couple people that have jumped in on YouTube. And we're also on, Twitter, Twitch, DLive, Facebook. And maybe one of these days I'll figure out how to stream it to Rumble. So anyway, Steve, welcome back. What do you have for us?
Hi. Well, I'd like to pick up a little bit. You sent me a bunch of videos. Dr. Hans Utter. Yeah. And it was over basically about how the CIA had infiltrated into the rock scene and Jerry Garcia and the whole crew.
Yeah, that was the Laying the Dead to Rest series. And people can find that over on Rumble, on my Rumble channel. I think YouTube has done their best to delete and suppress that series.
So what I talked to you about was basically that the philosophy seemed suspiciously the same as some other philosophies I had been researching, but they were ancient.
Oops, I didn't mean to do that. Where did it go? Here. Hopefully we're still streaming. Are you still there?
I'm still there.
All right, keep going.
Okay, so remember about a month or two ago, I suggested a book by a William Enfield, right?
Yep.
And it was a history book that has tons of information in it that you don't normally get in most places. Yep. History, philosophy from the earliest times, and it's hard to read in there, but it's drawn. It's the part of the title is drawn from Johann Jacob Brooker. And yeah, well, I mean, there's just tons of things going back to before Christianity, before probably in the early philosophers. You start looking at the book; it's got stories. If you take a normal philosophy course, you'll find. Basically, you'll have the 7 sages, and you'll have maybe one line from each of them, and they'll say that's all that's known to history. One says the world is just water. The other one says, like Zeno said that, Zeno's paradox, and you don't find a whole bunch of in-depth history on any because it's been claimed to not exist. So you open up that book and you find out you can look up just about anybody. He's got probably a page or two to all these different people. He's got background stories. He's got better expositions of the philosophies of these people. And you wonder, well, where's this coming from? Why does he have all this resources that seems to be lost? Well, where he's getting it from is, if everybody remembers the trial of Galileo, at the time, the head philosopher, the head scientist, you can't hardly call him that yet, was Clavius, Christopher Clavius. The name should be a little bit familiar because when in 2001, A Space Odyssey, when they land in a crater, the crater is called Clavius. But it was named after this astronomer scientist who was an ordained priest working for the Vatican at the time. At the end of his career, I think it's 1 or 2 replacements down the road, came in a guy named Athanasius Kircher. Athanasius Kircher had a lot of power, but he had a lot of curiosity. And so what he did is he actually sent emissaries around the world, because he was a Jesuit, and there at that time, the 1600s, the Jesuits were starting to infiltrate all the different civilizations just about everywhere. And that was part of your research in your book that we were talking about even a year ago, that we had discovered that one of the main reasons the church was colonizing is that Christopher Columbus had come to America, to the Caribbean, and basically found a bunch of cannibalism, which is Caribbean really means.
Yep.
So that's kind of a little bit of a side thing. But what happened is he sent these emissaries all over the place. Kircher was actually quite fluent in different things, and his main thing was magnetism. So he had constructed fairly intricate objects because he was trying to actually prove that such a thing as global positioning was possible. So all his Jesuit emissaries were going around. They were test cases, not only for his theory that you could construct a global positioning system off the magnetism if you could chart it all, but also all these emissaries were sending back to him, cataloging all the different histories of the world, and to Kircher, and Kircher would start publishing books right and left. He was probably the most prolific author of the 1600s, writing book after book after book. The problem with Kircher is he really didn't have a filter on any of this stuff. So a lot of it was, some of it was the occult, some of it was wholesome Christianity, and everything in between. And he would just publish these books, but the books ended up being seriously influential in society. As we go, if we get into this whole episode down the road, weeks to come, different things like Isaac Newton literally lifted his theory of light from Kircher, modified it a bit, and put it back into the public. And this went on around the place. Kircher's most famous work was called Oedipus Egypticus. And to give you a contrast between Newton, is that is literally the most popular book of Madame Blavatsky and that whole crew. Aleister Crowley, people are wondering where Aleister Crowley, and they've always wondered where's she writing from? Where's she getting her data from? Well, she's getting it from directly within the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church wanted to censor this stuff, but Kircher actually had a lot of tentacles around Europe at the time. Whatever the Catholic Church tried to censor, he'd run it up to Netherlands and get it published up there. So that became the source of a lot of history that had been missed. The only person that has gone over that history and attempted to sift it and see if the history was good or bad was Johann Jacob Brooker. And the only history book known where that book, for its most part, was translated to English was William Enfield, which is the book you just saw. And so for the most part, if you look at the book, and I've read the book from cover to cover, if you look at the book, most of the knowledge in there is wholesome, because he sifted out the bad parts. But he has put the bad parts in simply as criticism, as he noticed the rise of heresy. And he also cataloged that from a quasi-Christian point of view. So what you end up with at the end of the day is a better history source than most people today will acknowledge, especially for these ancient histories. Have I gone too far too fast yet? Or does that all make sense? Okay. So going back to Hans Utter, one of the main things that I think, and you can back me up on this or criticize it, whatever you need to do, because I'm going to try to paraphrase you here, is that it seemed to be the main philosophy of that was going on, is that everything ultimately would return or result in a singularity of some sort. that all the minds, and because you see it today with AI being talked all over the place, the creation of the one mind, and the that eventually all our minds will be assumed into the one mind or the Borg or something. It's a general theme in science fiction today. It's what's being worried about on a lot of channels today. And what you've shown is that really, I think I'm right in saying this, that really seemed to be a core doctrine of Jerry Garcia, the CIA back in the 50s and all that. Am I right about that? Or
Well, yeah. Well, let me ask you, who created the concept of transhumanism to begin with?
well, that's sort of the source of what we're going to be talking about. Who do you say? Who do you
Well,
think?
who created the actual word transhumanism was Julian Huxley.
Okay.
So, and of course, Aldous Huxley was behind MK Ultra, and Julian Huxley was a big eugenicist. But to me, the fact that Julian is behind the creation of transhumanism is part and parcel for everything we've been exposing on the show for the last decade.
Okay. That's kind of what I figured too. Now, the interesting thing is you go back to William Enfield's book, which is, again, from research done in the 1600s. That's the same theory William Enfield had, only it goes back to about 200 BC. And it turns out if you do the right research, you'll find out that was the heresy underneath the original heresies of Christianity. And if you also do the research, you'll find out that was the thing that Kircher was going for in the form of magnetism. That was the same theory that Newton was working under, because he had this inkling that magnetism, the apple falling from the tree, would somehow be the grand unified field theory, as Einstein put it, of the universe. So it's
quantum physics.
It's all tied together, that somehow, I don't know if you remember this, maybe this might have been a little bit before your time, but one of the big attractions in the 60s and late 60s, early 70s, I took astronomy in college, and one of the big things was that you would get the Big Bang. It would expand out to a point of a point of where the universe would have to implode on itself. And so they had this vision at the time of an expanding universe that would reach a point and then collapse and that go back to the Big Bang. And they envisioned the universe as this breathing entity of some sort. Somewhere, I think it was in the late 80s or something, they did tests on it and they found out that that was impossible, that the universe will keep on expanding. Astronomers and scientists were appalled at that, because they did not want to admit what was really a religious theory, that what was grounding their theory was that the perfection of the universe would be a singularity. And if that singularity, if the universe doesn't at some point implode upon itself, that singularity is basically proved impossible. So if you look through most of the theories of mathematics, of science, and I would say even most of religion these days, it's all based on the idea that the singularity is the perfection of humanity, or even of God.
Red shift problem, somebody is asking.
It all reeks to this problem. What happened, though, and this is very important, actually two things. The first is that in the 30s, you had a mathematician named Kurt Gödel, spelled Godel. And what he found is he came up with a theory, actually a principle. It's called the Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And there's a long story on this. I'll try to truncate it. There's tons of videos on YouTube anybody can look up. Most of them are mathematical, so they're kind of hard to follow. What Gödel found, and this is kind of the same thing I found about 20, 30 years ago. Actually, again, I took a logic course in college, and one of the things they said is we've talked about it on this show before, is the tautology, the logical tautology. And the quintessential sort of heretical tautology is the liar's paradox. In the Bible, you can find it. It's actually quoted in the Bible in the form of, all Cretans are liars. Okay. It sounds kind of innocuous until you realize the guy saying it is a Cretan. So the question becomes, all right, if all Cretans are liars, is he telling the truth or is he lying? A more simplified form is this sentence is false.
Yeah.
Okay. So Gödel took that sentence and he decided to turn it into a mathematical structure that he could either prove or disprove through mathematics. And at the end of the day, he came up with this odd formula. And if you go to YouTube and look up some of Gödel's incompleteness theorem, you'll find out all these scientists and mathematicians are kind of they're in disbelief. They've really hit a crisis in that everything mathematical, everything scientific has been reaching for the unified grand field theory or a singularity of sorts. And Gödel literally proved it impossible, that it's mathematically impossible, that ultimately what it results in is that any theory cannot prove itself.
Yeah.
And so what you need is something outside of the completeness that is actually incomplete in itself and unknowable in itself, that actually decides the truth of the thing that you're trying to complete. There's tremendous mathematical formulas and stuff like this, but you watch the YouTube videos on this, what you'll find is that mathematicians, scientists are just struck now because their goal of what they've sought is impossible. So the whole idea of this, now you got to think back, if Enfield is right through Kircher's research, that's precisely what was going on in the 1st and 2nd, 3rd century. And they literally connected together the idea that if you enter into this kind of thing, you not only, what you ultimately do is you disprove reality. So what Enfield was theorizing in all this is that somewhere early on, Plato was somewhat innocent, and all these other ones were somehow innocent. But by about the 2nd century, you had a philosopher named Iamblichus, depending on how you pronounce it. And what he did is he started integrating, marrying the Greek philosophy, particularly of Plato, with other philosophies, Egyptian philosophies like Pythagoras, and Indian philosophies like the Vedanta. And ultimately what he got was a contradiction that just can't be. All right. So the thing that got me curious on this is, having found all that, now if you can turn your eyes once again back to Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton really invented the whole idea of the Unitarians. And Enfield pushes the idea of the Unitarian as being the solution to logos. You do it, and you do the research on it, you find out, however, that the early church, the heresies were all founded on a group called the Alogi.
Yeah.
And
so anti-logos.
They didn't believe in the logos. They didn't believe in the book, the Gospel of John. They didn't believe in anything connected with that. So here, even though Enfield's done this wonderful research and he understands all this, he's ultimately siding with the Unitarians. And he doesn't recognize that that's a difficulty. So by the end of the book, what you do is you end up, and I can't believe this would be in the original because it would have happened after Kircher. But the end of the book has a long apology for the philosophy and theology of Isaac Newton. Now, anybody knows Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton supposedly invented calculus, which we know that's probably not as true as they'd like it to be. But by the end of his life, he's very much into religion, and what he's doing is he's trying to turn religion on its head. He considers himself a very strong Christian, and he believes in a lot of the Christian doctrine, but he becomes the underneath spokesman for Unitarianism. You do a little research on Isaac Newton and his friends, like particularly one was named Whiston. Underneath, they have this skepticism that Edison has turned into an Arian and that he's actually promoting Arianism. Arianism is the most profound heresy at the Council of Nicaea. And perhaps one of Newton's most important works is that he wrote a letter, it's called A Letter to a Friend, to corruption of Christianity. And the one is an attack on the verse found at 1 John 5:7, specifically attacking the idea of the Trinity.
Now, you had found that, and I'm just looking for my note that you sent me about a year ago, maybe 8-10 months ago, but you had found that they had originally written about logos in the margin, or no,
Right.
about the Trinity,
Right.
which, right. And then,
that's, go ahead.
well, and then this was the fact that it was put in the margin and kept in the margin for centuries is what the, let's call it the left, used to attack the idea of the Trinity and logos itself. And now I'm not seeing your, was that a PDF that you sent? Do you have it? Oh, I just found it. And this is in Latin here, but I'm going to share it on screen here. Let's see. Here we go. That should do it. Hopefully everybody can see that. So why don't you tell us about this?
This is actually, I forget the name of he's actually a cardinal, the Cardinal of London at the time. And he had found in the Church of it's written at the top, it's really Saint Cross in Rome, an inscription that other people hadn't found. And what it literally is a quotation from that verse. You can see it at the top. It's 1 John with a V. That's chapter 5, verse 7. And that'll be part of the book that I will be coming out with, hopefully. But it's literally a quotation that he found. At the time, they didn't have ways of photographing it or anything like that, so they just traced it. But it's a tracing of literally the fifth verse, chapter 7 of 1 John. If you could take that off, I'll go to mine, and what I'd want to do is I don't want to leave anybody behind at this point, because this is vital. What I'm trying to establish here is that the thing that's girding everything from the occult to science gone amok and everything is this idea of the singularity.
Yep.
And
let me just interrupt you there. Stephen, a few minutes ago, said kind of how the oversoul encompasses all and every action, no matter if it's good or evil, ultimately contributes into the eventual coming into reality, Adam Kadmon, the singularity, etc.
Right. Okay. So the whole point of that is that's the grounding principle of the occult. It's also the grounding principle of Hermeticism and all these doctrines, all these texts. One of the things that's puzzled me and is you find things like the Nag Hammadi text, you find like the Dead Sea Scrolls, you find more than enough adequate information to prove that this stuff is either falsified or corrupted or something like that. Yet you take it to academia, and academia can't dismiss it. They literally think it doesn't matter what evidence you provide, it's still true. So what happens is they've got a nifty little way of taking the reality, which is the evidence, and just sifting it away and clutching onto their grounding principle, which is an overriding thing on all their things, is this singularity. So what I'm saying is that we've been looking over history thinking that there's a secret society of people who are unwinding history. Well, the grounding rule is not a secret society. The grounding rule is this teaching. You start looking into one of the main people that tried to influence this was Napoleon. Napoleon, I've got the quotes, literally was trying to create his own religion. He was integrating Thoth and Hermes, and he was hiring people like Champollion to prove it by deciphering hieroglyphs, and they're all getting it from Kircher. You end up with this corruption that goes all the way back. But the weak link in Christianity is the verse that you've just seen there. They all realize, I'm convinced, going all the way back, that if you can corrupt that verse, you've now corrupted the main point. There's an odd sort of thing, and that Augustine at one point, I believe it is, has a mystical interpretation of that verse. And by mystical, it's not what you think. It's just a hidden meaning. And Augustine is convinced that the hidden meaning of the verse is that there's a point in the verse, I'll bring it up in a second that you can actually see it, is that it refers to the three holy witnesses. Well, in Jewish jurisprudence, the idea is that you need preferably three witnesses for anything to be true, but two will do in a pinch. So now you look at the Bible, there's really only two parts that it refers to logos as a doctrine, which we're all familiar with. But if that second verse, or that fifth verse, or fifth chapter, seventh verse, is taken out, and you can prove that it's not authentic to the Bible, you've just now taken out the second witness to logos in the Bible, which gives them authority to say, well, there was never such thing.
Right. Wow.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what I would like to do here is I've compiled probably more evidence of what was really going on. So my litmus test, I promised a litmus test. My litmus test that I've been using is following the controversy of that one small little verse, going all the way back as far as I could take it to Christ, to the episodes just after Christ and into the Arian heresy. And you fix in your mind that Newton was taking both sides of this issue. He was taking the side that gravity was the singularity, which was eventually picked up by Einstein and everybody else. But on the other side, and equal in what he produced in his writings, was an attack on this very verse. And so now you have to ask your question, was this by accident, or did he really know how to, was he one of the ones that knew how to corrupt Christianity? And if you go back to the Council of Nicaea, which is the forming, what would you call it? That's supposedly where the forming doctrine of the church was established, where Arianism itself was the heresy that they were worrying, literally would, if it was ever accepted to be true, would unwind Christianity for all time. You'll see that infection within the Christianity into Western society is really the basis of socialism, Marxism, bad science, bad philosophy, everything, everywhere you want to take it, into Freemasonry and everything.
I can't help but notice that all of these guys are members of the British Royal Society. And
Right.
thank
Well,
you.
That
Derek,
was one of the grounding rules of what
donation.
they're trying to prove, is the idea of the singularity, that everything returns. It's the grounding thing of Islam.
So Derek posted up a donation from Canada. He asks, do you have any idea about Mark 16 verses 9 through 19?
All right. So anytime you pick up any Bible, almost any Bible you want, if it says revised on it, even working in a seminary, I thought this was just a revised Bible, as you had scholars go through it and check it for errors and accuracy, and research was almost any Bible you pick up, if it says revised, it's taken. The main thing it's done is it's taken 1 John 5:7 out. It's taken the end of Mark out. A lot of times they'll take the ending of Mark and they'll put it in italics or something, or they'll put it at the bottom of the page. But those are the two main things that they've done. They want you to believe that they've done all this major research, that the case is closed, and only a fool would believe that these texts are authentic. But, for me, my defining point was when I realized I can't research everything under the Bible, but I can research the trajectory of that one verse. And outpoured that was just gobs and gobs and gobs of data. And every day I keep finding more, and I keep finding more proof that I'm right, that it was authentic to the Bible. It's just that they've shielded it off, and they don't want you to believe it, because I think what it would do is, the very reason the Aryans took it out is the very reason we can't have it today.
So let's see. I don't know if you know anything about this. Polar Camel is asking about the golden orb in King Charles' upcoming coronation, the Globus Cruciger.
I don't directly know anything about it. I know the golden orb was part of the seal of monarchy.
Yeah.
And I also know that, there is a point in English tradition that they believe that not all of them believe it, but it's kind of a legend that the Church of England picked up, and literally all the monarchy is coronated on the stone of Scone, which is believed to be the legitimate throne of Israel. And I would suspect that the orb is symbolic of that. You can tell me if I'm wrong or not. That would be just a speculation on my part.
All right. Well, that was a little off topic. So anyway, let's get back to the.
All right. So out of looking through all the different stuff, and oddly enough, if you just on a cursory thing go through the internet and find people talking about the legitimacy of this verse, you'll find a lot of web pages on it, maybe 20, 30 or so. But they're all copying each other, and a lot of the stuff that they put in there is not very good. In other words, they're copying the same web pages, and they're just copying the same mistakes and putting them all over. So I started out checking most of these and finding out most of them are sketchy. A lot of them are very real and good. But what I'd like to do right now is expose probably the most controversial of them, and probably the most believable on them, aside from actually reconstructing the history, which I'm doing. I think once you understand the history of all this, that in itself becomes fairly convincing. But I'd like to explain what really is underneath all this. So if I can find it here, one of the main, okay, I'm going to share a screen here. Do you see anything there?
Yep.
Okay. This is the proof by Bishop Burgess, who was a bishop of St. David's in England from 1756 to 1837. I assume that was his lifespan. And I'm going to zip to the bottom of here. So in this first section right here, you see the complete original Greek text. And underneath it, what you see is the truncated point of it, so you can see how they've corrupted it. Okay? And I'm going to explain that all in a minute. So what happens here is the main phrase of corruption would be, if you can see in the middle here, 1 John 5 said is the Father, the Word, or the Logos, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one. Okay, you see that?
Yep.
Okay, now I'm going to zip back up to the top here. There's an oddball thing that happens in Greek that doesn't happen in other languages. And here you see it. You have a masculine definitive article, you have a feminine definitive article, and you have a neuter definitive article. So in like a lot of languages, it doesn't happen in English very much, but in French and Romantic languages, Greek and stuff like that, everything has a masculine, a feminine, or a neuter nature. And in Greek, you can tell that nature because virtually even the name of a person, if I would talk to you, I'd say the Jan. If you talk to me, you would say the Steve. So they would put basically a the in front of everything. So when you're talking about you would talk about God, Logos, and the Holy Spirit. In Greek, it becomes the God, the Logos, and the Holy Spirit, that doesn't sound too foreign. But it's part of the language that they have to match those articles with the gender of the word itself. Oh, and that's signified by these articles that you can see here. The nominative in the masculine is O, which would be ha. A lot of times in Greek, they would put a marker atop of it, which means an H gets attached to it. This looks like an N. It's actually an H. And this is what it looks like, a TO, right? I'm going to zip back down to the bottom here. This is actually in the middle here. I won't read it, but that's actually the argument that Bishop Burgess said this is a fraud. You go down, and if you look through here, here's 1 John 5:6. It says, not by the water only, but by the water and the blood. And the Spirit is the one witnessing, because the Spirit is the truth. So the preceding truth has a feminine article. That's what the F is there to stand for. Now you go down to 1 John 5:7. The, which is a masculine article because it has to match the word Father. And the word, or the Logos, is another masculine article. And then you end up, and the Holy Spirit. Those are also masculine articles. And these three is also a masculine article. And the last one are one, and one is neuter, signified by the word the that is ahead of it. And then the following verse is the Spirit and the water and the blood, and the three are one. So not liking that, what they've done is they've literally taken the second this line here out. But what they've done is they've kind of cherry picked words to make it make sense. Okay.
Yeah.
So now if we go down, I'm going to go down the bottom. This is from the revised Greek. The revised Greek is in English, not by the water only, but the water and the blood, and the Spirit is the one witnessing, because the Spirit is the truth. Okay. For there are these, with a masculine article, three that testify. Okay, and then there's a note there. And then they zip straight over to 1 John 5:8, the Spirit and the water and the blood, and the three are in agreement. Okay. Now, the problem with this, as he points out, is not only have they done slander to the definite articles, they've had to retranslate the word one into in agreement. You see that? So what happens is now you end up, for these three that testify, the three there are masculine, but in 5:8, they're all neutered.
Wow.
So what happens here is the bishop is convinced, and he gets this actually from a guy that goes all the way back to the late or the early 1700s, a guy named David Martin. But he goes back in there and says, this is evidence that a phrase has been taken out. Because if the phrase was there, as it was in all the other Bibles, the definite articles would match. And you wouldn't have to retranslate the word one into in agreement. You see that?
Yeah, and I see so many people using this removal as justification against Trinitarian doctrine.
Right.
And you've got it, it's very clearly laid out here on exactly how they corrupted and took it out. But interestingly, in the King James Version, it's actually in there.
Right.
And the Douay Rheims as well, correct?
Well, all right, this brings into the other part, and we can get into it another date. But the thing was, and this is the rub on the whole thing. As we said before, there are no surviving modern texts that seem to refer to the phrase. If you do the research, the only texts that use the phrase And, the scholars will argue about it, but they can't really get rid of it. I'm going to take this off and go back to live here.
Yeah.
There was a dispute in Africa, northern Africa, about the time of the Council of Nicaea, and a similar dispute in Spain at that time. These texts, the ones in northern Africa, are called the Vetus Latina. Modern scholars will dismiss them because they're written by a bunch of amateurs. The same thing happens in Spain. They'll say, well, this is irrelevant because these people are amateurs. They're not the official copy. So if you remember, what really didn't settle with me, about a year ago, we were talking about Tischendorf and the followers of Tischendorf. Tischendorf went down to Sinai and discovered a codex called the Codex Sinaiticus. And that he had declared that, and probably with reason, as the oldest Bible. And they're missing that text. That became popular. This whole discussion begins with Erasmus in like the 1400s, I believe it is, that texts were coming over from Russia and from the East. And they had that line, the missing line, penciled in the margins. I think I sent you something on that.
Yeah.
Well, the issue is ever since then, they've been trying to say that these are bastardizations, that it's not supposed to be there. And when it comes to the Vetus Latina text, which is about 50 in number, they say, well, those are falsified text. The Tischendorf Bible is considered the oldest. It's missing it. That becomes the basis of the Revised Bible. It's also missing that chapter of Mark we were just talking about. By about 1880 or so, they decided to change all the Bibles. And so you saw the new Revised Bible, which is literally the King James without that verse. And it's a result of Tischendorf. So the problem...
And that's the modern or the new King James?
It's really the modern King James.
So, in other words, for an English Bible, just stick with the King James or the Douay-Rheims, right?
Do your research. I mean, obviously the Greek is the most reliable, but nobody reads Greek.
Right.
There's issues with those a little bit, just simply because of, various things, but in general, they're right. The thing is what was screamed out at me at the time is all the Vetus Latina were written right on the heels of when Tischendorf says the Codex Sinaiticus was written. And the Codex Sinaiticus is backed up by an identical copy in Rome called the Codex Vaticanus. And so everybody feels that's the oldest, that's the best reputable one, that all these Christians that are writing the Vetus Latina are trying to falsify the Bible. But I think we can gain a little knowledge from what's going on today. The Codex Sinaiticus was considered another example, and the Codex Vaticanus was considered an example of the official Bible authorized by the Council of Nicaea to go out and be distributed to all over the world as being the core Bible, the reference Bible for everybody else. But I think if you look at what's going on now, and I think this is what's added a lot to my understanding of this, what happens to people in general when they think the government or the ruling thing is going wrong? The ruling party says, if you want to drink Bud Light, you got to support this. If you want to drink this or do that, what people go off on their own. They don't trust the text. So they make their own copies. And I think that, and if you actually look at the timelines, this makes complete sense. That now you start looking, and this is for another time, but what you find is everything, all hell breaks loose at the Council of Nicaea, and they're covering it all up. It doesn't take a whole lot of research to go back and find out that the pat story of the Council of Nicaea isn't what happened. They want to portray that Athanasius won and the Trinity was invented at the Council of Nicaea and put in. That's not what happened. The Arians won. that led to Julian the Apostate, was the emperor. He ended up killing and destroying all the churches in every he could find and destroying texts, but they don't want to admit to that. And if once you look at this, you find this makes complete sense. That what they were doing was private citizens didn't like, I believe, private citizens as we have now, don't want to go around. They see a lie going on. So what do? They make their own copies. They proliferate their own copies. And they basically turn their nose up at the empire. Let me bring up two charts, and it's at a later date. I'd like to look at these a little bit better. But what you have here, this is a chart of the conventional understanding of Christianity. Can we see that?
Yep.
Okay, so you have the birth of Christ. About 80-33, Christ dies. And about 70 AD, you have the diaspora, where the Jews are basically flee for their safety all over the globe. And all this time, modern scholars say Christianity literally was a Gnostic cult inside Judaism. And once the Jews fled, the authentic old Christianity, this is advocated by Karen King and Bart Ehrman and all these. To be honest with you, a lot of the mainline churches, even though they won't tell their people that this is literally what they believe. It's become the accepted theory. They're just sort of waiting to spring it on people. So what happens somewhere around 180, Gnosticism gets recognized as a bad thing, and it gets kind of sent underground. Christianity starts falling apart. And then by the time you get to 325, you have the Council of Nicaea. Orthodoxy wins. They make everything else illegitimate. But ultimately what they're saying is that orthodoxy is an invention of the Council of Nicaea by the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church is trying to own the whole. They're trying to own the empire through Christianity. And the remnant of that today is the Roman Catholic Church. Okay? That story is completely fictitious. And it doesn't take a whole lot of research to find that out. All the people beforehand and led up to the Council of Nicaea, there was this looming thing called Neoplatonism. By the time you get to the Council of Nicaea, for some reason, unexplicable reason, Athanasius does win the Nicene Creed, but it gets shelved until 380 with the Council of Constantinople. In the meantime, all the parties involved are Neoplatonists. The Constantine the Great, which was considered the guy who substantiated Christianity as the core religion of the empire, never did that. He literally was baptized as a Christian on his deathbed, but the baptizing priest was an Arian. All the people surrounding were Arians. By the time Julian Apostate, they're literally firing anybody who has any Christian connections whatsoever. They're jaunting around the empire, burning down Christian churches. They literally sent the Jews back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, which they almost did until it was struck by lightning and burnt down again. You end up with this long story, which the conventional idea of the Council of Nicaea being the pivot point it's just not true. And it's demonstrably not true. But it is true if we switch scenarios.
Unwashed Brain says Plato is cool.
Do we want to talk about Plato?
Oh, good grief. Yeah. Well, I recommend they go back to our series on normalizing schizophrenia and all of that, because we go into Plato and all of that, So
well, very briefly, you've got three sets of dialogues that Plato wrote. The first set of dialogues, it's blatantly, he's just a biographer of Socrates. The second set, Plato's becoming Socrates. And by the time you get to the third set, Socrates is just an invention. It's basically a vehicle whereby Plato can talk about his own stuff. And so the question is, I asked, that's what we were talking about, what I asked you, when Plato kills off himself with hemlock, the death he dies has nothing to do with a real hemlock death. It sounds more like, and it sounds more like a drug episode of some sort. And if you look into Socrates' legend, it seems widely admitted he was schizophrenic for some reason.
Yeah.
And it also seems like Plato, for some reason, picks up off of that. And
well, that sure explains all of this primacy of consciousness monopsychism we've been dealing with for the last 2,000 plus years as well. And into Hermeticism and the rest of it.
Well, and that's Enfield. Enfield's catalog that almost exactly is he goes back and says, what we've accepted as a culture, especially occult stuff, which is proliferating everywhere, is the idea that Plato and Pythagoras kind of lived at the same time, and Pythagoras taught Plato all these secret occult Egyptian doctrines. And Enfield adequately proves that the timeline doesn't work. There's no way, Pythagoreanism is too old for Plato. It's just out of time. It's anachronistic. It doesn't work. But by the time just before Christianity and just into Christianity a bit, you find a marriage going on between Thoth and Hermes and between Pythagoras and Plato, and it's impossible.
So we have a couple of comments here. So Polar Camel asks, can you get Christ Logos without the Greek tradition of the Logos? And then Just Frank says, I was going to try and pin it on O.J. Simpson, but Plato will do.
Well, I mean, it's not like the Jews didn't have their own Logos doctrine too. But the main philosophy about that time was kind of what's going on today. It was called eclecticism, where everybody was just grabbing bits and pieces to authenticate their own lifestyle, and so they didn't see any big problem with marrying Pythagoreanism to Plato and Thoth to Hermes and read into it whatever they want.
Well, and Orfeo Treshula says, okay, shortly, liberalism was rising then in an age where human sacrifice was accepted. And, you and I, when I was finishing up the new book last year, that's exactly what we discovered. And so, yeah, I mean, it wasn't just human sacrifice, it was human sacrifice and cannibalism. And I wouldn't be surprised if and we've already actually seen some of it. Who's that guy that writes all the anti-Christian propaganda promoting cannibalism and whatnot, Yeah.
But I mean, I was watching Naomi Wolf, and her big thing is protecting the rights of children and stuff like that. And she's Jewish, and she herself talks into the Jewish heritage of going back 1,000 years before Christ of, child sacrifice and child labor and things like that. I sent a letter to you. I think you used it in the book, where the Jesuit missionaries that came to the United States, in the 1700s were documenting case after case of cannibalism.
Yeah.
Same thing.
I used a little bit of it, but yeah, you had found a whole
40 pages,
a whole series of books that were originally written in French and transcribed into English by some group out by you.
Right.
But yeah, and you have all of these different reports everywhere of cannibalism in the Americas, and people are sold this horse-pucky nonsense of the proto-hippie Native American that never existed, and in fact,
one of the things that convinced me more is what we're going through right now is it gives you the sight that you can look back and recognize something 2,000 years ago. That I'm convinced what they were going through is exactly what we're toying with now.
Yeah. Well, and when we go back and we look at this, so the argument put out in beginning in 1979 by Orns and some of these other professors was that it was all xenophobia, ethnocentric othering, and that the Christians made up all of the references of human sacrifice and cannibalism. Never mind that you had dozens of different sources. So earlier we talked about 2 or 3 testimonies being, a given truth. Well, what if you have 40 or 50 or 100 or several hundred testimonies of people committing human sacrifice and cannibalism? So what I think happened was,
or in the fact that they're reverting to it in some degrees.
Right. Well, but what I think happened was that after the 17th century, the Native Americans gave up cannibalism and human sacrifice. And then come the 1850s, and now I forget his name, but he created the Native American Church. And what I think happened was during the 1850s, they decided to go back and manufacture this proto-hippie peace and love type Native American and push it back into history as their original philosophy. But if you go in and you read the original primary citations of settlers and people of the time, and it's all available, you see that there was human sacrifice and cannibalism going on everywhere. And in fact, there was a couple of professors, they had investigated the whole Chaco Canyon thing, and they found that it was rampant with cannibalism, and they were able to show it throughout. And of course, you have, the Native Americans will attack these professors and say, well, we don't have any oral history of this in our tradition, so therefore you made it all up, and never mind that they have DNA evidence, they have bone evidence, they have, all of this, different evidence in the archaeology that proves that these cultures like from Chaco Canyon, et cetera, were cannibals. And what they argue is that, they got fed up with what was going on in by the Mexica or the Aztecs and what's now Mexico City. So they migrated northward and founded Chaco Canyon and basically recreated the same thing all over again.
What I liked your line is one of the things I found in these documents the book was called Jesuit Relations. But what I found was that they would give communion to these Indians. And I liked your line is that they instantly quit being cannibals.
So
you said they found out they didn't have to eat their kids.
Right. Well, and what happened was in 1503, Queen Isabella of Spain issued an edict that said, look, in all of our territories around the world, if people are cannibals, if they give up cannibalism and become Catholic Christians, they're to remain free. Anybody who is not a cannibal was to be free and treated fairly. So, I think what happened was when Columbus got to the coast of Mexico, and you find this in the Florentine Codex, Book 12, The Conquest, which was written in Nahuatl by the Aztecs themselves. But I think so many surrounding tribes were completely fed up with Montezuma and the Aztecs. And just to add, in 2015, in Mexico City, they found one of the original temples that the Spanish wrote about 500 years ago. And they always said, well, the Spanish made it up. Well, now they've found these temples. But there were over 100,000 human skulls of the Aztecs, human sacrifice cannibal victims. And so now we have the archaeology that proves that what the Spanish wrote was true. And then, I think that the reason why so many tribes joined up with the Spanish was they were just fed up, and they were like, wait a second. If we accept Christ as the last sacrifice and we just drink wine in remembrance of him being the last sacrifice every week, we don't have to be cannibals anymore. We don't have to worry about being eaten anymore. We don't have to eat others any others anymore. And they said, I'm in.
Right. Well, and then they take the Catholic Church, which has transubstantiation. You literally are drinking the blood of in another form, and that would make perfect sense that somebody, an Indian, would say, "Oh, I can do this, and I'm free to go. I don't
Yeah.
have to do this."
Yeah. And never mind that, so many tribes lived in constant fear, and the Spanish write about it, and the Aztecs and Nahuatl write about it, but a lot of the Aztec peasants were starved, and when the Spanish would go to war trying to free these tribes, they were so starved that they would eat, the dead people that they came across, and the
Right.
Spanish were appalled, but they had to put up with it, and they talk about it.
Right. Right. Anyhow, what I'd like to do as a last little bit here, I'd like to put up one more screen.
Sure. And are we going to go deeper? What do you want to do next week or something? You had more, I think.
I think you could literally talk about this all for several episodes at least, and if not, because I keep finding more stuff. There's a nuance here that I'd like to show you as a kind of a preparation for maybe future stuff. I'm going to share this with you, so you're not there. Can you see that?
Yep.
Okay, this is a timeline I kind of made. And this is what this is the genesis of this whole thing. With on the side of it is there's two timelines, one graphic and one just as a matter of time. You start off with Aristobulus about 200 BC, and he's the first Jewish guy who this is taken from Enfield too, and a couple other accounts. But you have Aristobulus, he's a Jewish philosopher, and he decides he's going to integrate Platonic and Pythagorean ideas within Judaism. Then you get Christ in John's gospel. But fairly early on, you get this, and it's odd because Enfield has quite a lot on him. But I've done research on this guy before, and I've insisted decades ago that this was probably the bad guy in all this. And now the research is starting to surface where I can find it, is Ammonius Saccas. And the point that I try to make, and I can't go in so much tonight, but I'm literally starting to believe that the idea of a singularity is literally a principle of ignorance. That you need a Trinitarian understanding, because you try to go towards a singularity, you bail out on everything else underneath it. Everything you do becomes in service of that grand unified theory, and all contradictions become irrelevant towards that theory. And you find that in your daily life, that you talk to people into the occult, or people that are, into New Age religion. They're constantly in, one of the charts I'd like to bring up at some point is the number of mental problems and documented things, people into yoga.
Yeah.
You
yeah.
know,
Well, didn't you send me something, or somebody sent me something some months back?
yeah, I did.
Okay. And it was a video of this guy going through, breaking down how meditation causes psychotic breaks.
Right. And so I'm convinced Ammonius Saccas is the guy that discovered this. And I think I've connected through this for another time, where he got it from, how he got it. And they literally thought it was the reason why reality, in the past, I would say that the core doctrine of Gnosticism was a denial of reality, but we didn't go far enough. I didn't go far enough. What really is the deciding feature here is the one singularity thing, because what happens once you believe in that principle, everything underneath it is expendable. Any contradiction that shows up, you dismiss it. You get the Codex Sinaiticus, you get the Hermetic doctrines, you get, the Dionysian letters and stuff like that. All of these betray an occult problem with all of it. It doesn't matter to them. All they care about is this overarching umbrella principle, and whatever contradictions underneath it is irrelevant to them. So what happens here, Ammonius Saccas teaches Plotinus. Plotinus gets documented by his disciple Porphyry. And this is a stuff, again, this is another episode. But the documentation, they're saying it flat out. This isn't something that's disguised. And then you get into Arius. Arius literally is saying the same thing. They're literally talking about the one mind. They're literally talking about, ignorance as a principle. So my litmus test here is that it's not so much a denial of reality and the things we think about Gnosticism, is that you have the Freemasons, you even have a lot of mainline Christianity that's into this one principle, this singularity thing, and be damned everything underneath it, because they're all in service of that one thing. They think it's proof of a principle of God or something like that, but they can't see that this is an impossibility, as Gödel showed, proof positive of. So I'm convinced what happens then, if you can follow the chart around, the ones in the light green are kind of where Christianity kind of skips through the whole thing. The other ones are basically heretics that are proliferating this thing up until the Council of Nicaea. And then I got one more chart here I want to show you real quick.
Just a second, Unwashed Brain is saying, isn't the Holy Trinity triune? Yes, of course. So there is only one God, one truth. But it's like, just to put it into context really quickly, you have the trivium, you have grammar, logic, and rhetoric to arrive at truth. You can't have truth without a method of getting to it, without a method of discovering it, right? And how would you answer what he said there about triune?
Well, what I would say is, I just made this case today in what I was writing, is I was looking at the actual documents of Arius, and there's very little writings of his, but there is one writing called Thalia. And Thalia has a point in there where his main thing, not as advertised that most people see, and you can actually document it, was that logos is secondary to God. It comes down the line somewhere. What you end up is what Socrates called the Euthyphro dilemma. And the Euthyphro dilemma is, does God decree laws because they are good, or are they good so he decrees them? So what they're asking is, does reason predate God, or does it come after God? If it predates God, then God's the demiurge. He's a secondary bumpkin God. If reason comes after, then he just made it up and it becomes arbitrary. The only way that the whole formula exists is these three truths, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, have to exist as one entity. And that's the only way that you can resolve the Euthyphro dilemma, is that they're different aspects of the same thing.
Interesting.
Okay. So this is the last chart, and we'll just see more of this chart down the road. But you have the birth of Christ, you have 33 AD, which was supposed to, if you remember the other chart, around 69, 70 AD of the diaspora. That's a complete lie. It did exist around that. That was the destruction of Jerusalem. But the real problem happens about 132 AD, in that the Jewish troops amassed this huge army that rivals the power of Rome. They almost beat Rome. And what happens, it's called the Bar Kokhba Wars. What happens is they appeal to the Christians to take part in the war, and they would have been just enough to overthrow the Roman Empire, but the Christians refused to fight. So that all fails. That's when you get the real diaspora. Christianity goes on as the line goes above into its own sect. Around 180, it gets infected by Gnosticism, which when the alogi, that's when the alogi start. And their core doctrine is really what we call today, we've called it as monopsychism. The orthodoxy is based on logos, and so you have these two branches of Christianity that meet up at the Council of Nicaea. And eventually they spin off. The Orthodox becomes the enemy because everybody else is Arian. The whole thing doesn't get resolved until 381. And this gets into another thing. How do we know that this monopsychism is the worst heresy of all heresies? Well, it was declared so by the common condemnation in 1277 of the Catholic Church, that the grounding heresy of all heresies is the one mind. They admit it.
Wow. Well, and just to give an example here, I'm going to pull this up for people to see. Hold on just a second. And this is just coming at it from another perspective here. But we have Father, Son, Holy Ghost. We have it in Latin and English, and then we have it as the Trivium.
All right. And if you stopped right there, I would dare say that if you put the Greek on top, it would be the same thing.
Instead of the Latin over here?
Yeah. The only difference, and this actually, the reason I bring this up is because if you put the Greek on top there, which is almost the same as the Latin, you would see that the term est really would have a gender attached to it that has to be followed. So again, you would have the Pater, the Filius, and the Spiritus Sanctus. In Greek, that would be a masculine article, which gets violated by the taking the formula out of the Bible, because the things that they're attaching it to have neuter articles.
Right. Which you showed earlier.
Right.
Wow. So how much more do you want to go on tonight?
I think I've probably done enough for tonight. What I'd like to do is, going down the road, there's a lot you can imagine. My mind is, I started this, when I use this program called Scrivener,
Right.
and it makes this huge file. And usually when I make a file, it's got books and PDFs and everything. Most of the files I've got here are just copies. They're not even big files. And I got a gig and a half of data on this, because once I discovered that this was the principle, I've just got gobs of data, because all of history seems to pour out at you. And you could do an episode on any one of these. Athanasius Kircher, for example, is both the grounding of modern science and the grounding of the occult. But hardly anybody ever knows about him. You end up with all these phony stories of Newton and whatever. And you've got an episode there. You've got an episode talking about Ammonius Saccas. You've got an episode of Plotinus and Porphyry, and it's all stuff that the documentation is now there, and you can see exactly what was going on.
Well, in a future episode, I would like to go into how it all comes, how these cults, these secret societies, come out of Egypt, and the basically the faking of these ancient philosophies.
Okay, real brief. That was Napoleon. Napoleon
Right.
went into it with the idea of creating, and I've got the quotes. He went in there as a hermeticist. He enlisted all these scientists, which he labeled savants. The savants went, even though most of them got killed in the wars and things like that, the ones that were able to return to Europe, they're the ones. It wasn't directly the Freemasons. What it was is they infiltrated the Freemasonic societies. The Freemasons were, in a sense, sort of an internet of the time, that they could pass information back around. And so they infiltrated the Freemasons. That became underneath the way they transmitted their doctrines around. Napoleon hired Champollion. Champollion, and I've got this evidence too. Everybody thinks his main publication was to do with the hieroglyphs. That was only a letter that he wrote to somebody else, that he kind of wrote by accident, but not for dissemination. The guy's name was Dacier. That became published. The book he did publish was on the occult. That it was all the pantheon of Egypt. And I've got the section here where he literally marries, like we said, Hermes to Thoth. And it's all based on documents that go way back. They're obviously fraudulent, but people accept it as legitimate research. That becomes the inspiration for all these new age cults. And so it's all there now. Once you go through it, and once you see, now Enfield couldn't known about that because he lives before that time, but it's not very hard to pick up where Enfield left off and go into where we are now.
And you had found some material through the Oxford University. Do you want to discuss that?
Which was, I thought, got lots of stuff like that. Which one?
You found a book from Oxford University that basically admitted that they knew about the argument against that they were creating manufacturing against the Trinity.
That a lot of this stuff is that, see, something happens. Just as a stream of consciousness for myself here. I always think of Tucker Carlson because he's an Episcopalian. And I've worked in the Episcopal Church for a long time. And Tucker says the Episcopal Church has become one of the stupidest churches in the world. Well, in the 1800s, it was the pinnacle of all churches. They were running Oxford University. They were running Cambridge and stuff like that. And so at some point in time, Oxford kind of flips around. And it's the same thing that happened in Vatican II. They start switching sides.
Yeah.
Instead of protecting things, they all become disseminators of this crap.
Well, and I think that, one of the largest purveyors of the crap is the British Royal Society, and when we look at the British Royal Society, Carl and we've got Karl Marx, B.F. Skinner, John Wilkins, Francis Bacon, Sir Isaac Newton, Julian Huxley, Thomas Henry Huxley, Ben Franklin.
There's a Catholic side of this, in that before the 1800s, there was actually two Catholic priests, both named Lagrange. And I believe they purposely confused the two because one is very orthodox. The other one is, there was an encyclical written by Pius X on modernism. It's literally written against this guy. And he starts the St. Stephen's, I think, monastery in Jerusalem. That monastery, even though it's shut down, declared a heresy. By the time it becomes World War II, the monastery is started back up again. He's publishing books already, and that becomes a repository of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And oddly enough, one of the encyclicals by the Pope during World War II predicts that they're going to find documents that prove Gnosticism is right.
Yeah. Well, Kurt Gödel is also out of the Royal Society.
Yeah.
So you start seeing all these connections to this one group, Rupert Sheldrake, of course, who created the big old stink about a decade ago on TED Talks, which of course is about as ridiculous propaganda as it comes.
No, they all know each other.
Yeah. But, I've thought for at least 5-7 years that the Royal Society is probably the largest purveyor.
But think about it. Think about it for a second. Really, what principle does science hold above all other principles?
What's that?
Well, they're all trying to attain this unified field theory, the theory that explains, the simple theory that explains everything.
Right.
So, and they will sacrifice any underneath principle in service of that principle. What I'm saying, forget everything else. That is the secret cult right there. It's not hidden. It's right in front of your eyes. You accept the idea that this unity is the theory that explains all. And then you look at the incompleteness theory, that no theory can explain itself. You end up with a corruption of all reason. So the thing that they idolize above all different types of thought is known to be a farce. It can't work.
Yeah.
So whether it's the Royal Society, whether it's your neighborhood schoolyard, whether it's the New Ager, you meet downtown somewhere or something like that, they hold this principle above all principles. So you go in there and say, I don't want to get you banished or anything like that, but anything that's come up in the last 2.5 years, you start talking about that, it's not in service of this one. Well, now you start realizing there's a lot of euphemisms for that one. One is Marxism, one is socialism, one is New Age stuff, one is Allah.
Right.
So I don't think it's a far stretch for me to say, is this a principle of knowledge or is it a principle of ignorance?
Well, it's a principle of ignorance, I think. Orfeo says the devil is a jester then. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's see. And I had just mentioned that, somebody brought up the peer review system, which of course was created by Thomas Henry Huxley. And that was to keep dissenting opinions out. Now, Buntownick says Kircher was a Kabbalist. The source of heresy is Kabbalah. Obviously,
That's true.
well, the Kabbalah is a lot newer, I think, than most people think than Neoplatonism, though, or than Plato itself.
Enfield would say otherwise, but I would argue against that in the sense that I don't think Kircher was any one thing at all. I think he was the quintessential eclectic. I think he could be a true Jesuit when he wanted to be a Jesuit. He could become a Kabbalist if he wanted to be that. He was the quintessential New Age thing. He could be Orthodox when he wanted to appear Orthodox. He could be
a chameleon.
He was a chameleon. Yeah, exactly right. And all you got to do is look at a little bit of his writings. There's times he's brilliant. There's times he's in over his head.
And so then if we go into Emanuel Swedenborg and Dr. John Dee and all of these guys,
they're all out of that same tributary.
Right, exactly. And
so I mean, don't dismiss Kircher too quickly because, and I'm not saying don't judge him or anything like that. I'm saying see him as integral to all this. Don't just say, well, he's just an occultist. I believe he is the nexus of the whole thing. And that out of him becomes all these things. I believe personally, and I can show proof in another episode. Newton, when he had his diagrams of the triangle and the prism and light flowing through, it was just a reworking of Kircher's diagram. When Champollion went into Egypt and said that the old hieroglyphs don't work and we need to revise that, he's working off of Kircher's hieroglyphs. And you can kind of go around even in Descartes and all this kind of stuff. They were all high critics of Kircher, but underneath they're also advocates of Kircher.
And they were all agents here.
Well, all right. That brings up an interesting thing in itself. What was Isaac Newton?
A secret agent?
You could arguably, what Isaac Newton towards the end of his life, Isaac Newton towards the end of his life started getting into religion and all this other stuff, but he had run dry as a scientist and mathematician. He literally had joined the treasury and was an agent that would go into bars dressed up as, in disguise, trying to arrest people for passing false currencies and stuff like that. So you could argue that he was the first treasury agent.
At the core of all of this, the only way to unravel all of this is to understand logos, right?
Yeah. Well, but that's my point, is if you hold singularity, we need a better name for it, but if you hold singularity as your main principle, then everything else is expendable underneath. And I don't think it's like the average guy walking around gets rid of contradiction, because he knows when something hurts. He knows when something makes him cry. He knows when his gas tank gets empty and he's got to fill it. But for some reason, when he shifts into high gear and goes in pursuit of his dreams of this singularity, then reality be damned. It doesn't matter what's going on. It doesn't matter if it contradicts. This is an overarching principle that has to be served in their mind.
Let's see. I'm just reading comments here, see if anybody has anything to add. So anyway, if you can understand primacy of consciousness and monopsychism, and you can get in underneath Neoplatonism and grasp that the original Christianity was the antithesis of literal nonsense or schizophrenia, then we can see what the goal of Christianity was. And the outcome, the end outcome of all of this monopsychism or synchronicity, etc., is, well, then, if there is no reality, there is no truth. If there is no truth, then everything goes. Then we can have pedophilia, we can have human sacrifice, we can have cannibalism.
But I think you have to go one step further, and that's what I've just discovered even this last week or so, is that in researching Ammonius Saccas, it's claimed, and I've found text to back it up, that what he was really integrating was the Vedanta, which oddly enough, the word struck me for a while. And then I realized about 10 years ago, somebody sent me a book. In fact, I got it laying here. Here you go.
Yep.
So that book is literally a rationalization how all science came from the Vedanta. And they, if you do a little bit of research, you realize that Ammonius Saccas was trying to integrate that into Western thought.
Yeah. Well, and then, that means that there's something to it when people say science seance, they're.
Well, let me read here from just one line, if I can find it here quick. Because this is all, I'm probably going to pronounce it wrong. So there's a principle here, and there's a line here that's literally copied from the Egyptian or the Indian text. And I believe I'm not going to find it here, but it's called that the underneath principle is a thing called samadhi. And that principle, if you look it up, and there's several sites you can check it out, that if you break it down, it literally is a principle of ignorance. And that if you look at the chart, and you can see this is even on Wikipedia, you can pull it off and you see that the very act of reason under this system is considered interference. And that interference is disrupting of the one. So their doctrine itself says what we need to do is get rid of reason, because it's just interference to the one. To really get to the one, you've got to get rid of reason.
Well, isn't that?
It's a principle of ignorance.
Well, that's Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception. You had to shut off the mind. You had to stop the input from your eyes and your hands and your ears, etc. And you go inward. You don't gather who, what, where, when, why, or how. This is why this guy Aldous Huxley, who didn't know how to wipe his own rear end from his letters that I've cited on the show in the past, this is how this mad psychopath has dominated the world with his psychopathy since the 1930s.
Right. But take a breath for a second and look at it. What Western society now holds as its most highest principle is literally a principle of ignorance.
Yeah. Right. Because, if there is no truth, then anything goes. That's ignorance, literally. And that's what we see rampantly.
You get into yoga and all this stuff, all of a sudden you tied a ribbon around the whole thing, and you start seeing that these are all methods that they're not just, we want to believe as a society that these are just anxiety reducing things. These are just ways of calming the body down or the mind down and stuff like that. But the method is basically numbing your brain to contradiction.
Well, sure. Well, and the left even came out 5-7 years ago, maybe more, stating straight out that logic and reason was abuse, know. And why would they promote that idea? Is because they want total ignorance. They want stupidity.
So everything fits.
And then you had the news media going on during C-19 that, you don't want to do your own research. You don't want to look at anything. You want to have ignorance. You want to just follow what we tell you. That's all that matters.
Right. And what happened to me is that, I mean, I took all these Jesuit courses and stuff like that, and they were great. They were very interesting. But I realized the average mind doesn't want to take the time. They don't want to wrap your mind around it. But what I think one of the main ways of convincing people of this isn't so much philosophically, is over and over and over again, give episodes in history, real events that show this is what's going on. It's not only more interesting, I think there's something therapeutic about going to all these different episodes and saying, well, this is what this guy really was wrestling with. This is what he was really trying to do. This is where he thought he'd end up. Here's where he really ended up. And you go through the whole thing, and all of a sudden your conviction towards truth becomes more and more solidified in a way that just knowing the philosophy behind it doesn't do.
Yeah. Well, I'm a herb, something like that in the chat says it's a war on reality. Exactly right.
Yep.
And once you get it,
but
once you get it, you can see what Christianity has been fighting against for 2,000 years and why it's been infiltrated with.
Yeah. But that's exactly the problem, is that the main general against this has been reduced to a private. And until we tell the real story, we've got a battle. We have to argue every one of these little episodes as if it's vital.
Right.
Where in reality, we have a much better story that's much believable, and you can look it up. It's true.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's probably a good place to wrap it up for this episode. I recommend people go back and watch our shows on normalizing schizophrenia and whatnot, so that, because it's solidified, or that's kind of the precursor to tonight's show. But obviously you're going in a lot deeper into the actual history of this stuff than we knew about, a year and a half ago. So anything you want to add, Steve?
Well, this is all stuff I'm in the middle of researching, but I'm very excited that I think as I tried to advertise, I think that this is a simple principle, that you realize that what we hold dearest and highest today is really a principle of ignorance. And look at these things afresh. There's more data out there than you know.
So Bren asks, is prayer a proper form of meditation?
I think there's proper forms of meditation. You got to understand, I think that the yoga principle, and a lot of people probably never gets dangerous. It's just something, but it's a pathway. There's some very good videos on YouTube of people pulling out of yoga. The different positions that they take are really in homage to different deities. And at some point, it's not the prayer or the meditation itself. There's a lot of different words etymologically that go back to ideas like pondering and thinking and stuff. I think there's dangerous ways of thinking, and I think there's calming, healthy ways of thinking. You don't want to get into any of these things. There's episodes in my life where I went through anxiety and stress and things like that, where you wake up in the middle of the night with cold chills and stuff like that. And so you try to distract yourself, and then you take a drug or something to see if you can calm down. But ultimately, the way you defeat all that stuff is embracing reality.
Right. Yep. Exactly. Exactly. All right. So are we finished? Is that a good spot to wrap it?
I think it's a good spot.
All right, Steve, have a great night. Thanks everybody who joined us this evening. I did finally figure out what happened with Rumble. I forgot to flip a little switch. So the people over at Rumble missed the first 4 or 5 minutes, but it did start streaming over there as well. And we will continue on this current rabbit hole to see where it takes us.
That's what I was thinking right there. Did we go down too big a rabbit hole?
Yeah. Well, all right. And good night, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And thanks for the donations and support in the chat. Unwashed Brain just donated. We had Derek donate from Canada earlier tonight. Thank you so much. And we will See you next time. Take care, everybody. And let me see if I can figure out how to stop it. All right, here we go. Good night.